morning.
Good morning.
So I feel like it's good to start the day with a good news, good news story, which is the good news, and the fact that all of you are here speaks to it, is the extraordinary focus we are seeing on these issues, not just of social responsibility, but of equity, of inclusion throughout public and private sector. The bad news is that a certain amount of the efforts and the strategies to address these issues, the research suggests, are not effective. The good news is that IRIS in particular has insights that are extraordinarily helpful about how to solve that problem. So as a starting point, we have been reading for years about how women have matched and in many cases surpassed men in academic achievement, in rates of graduation from high school, from college, from graduate school. At entry levels in many firms, gender parity has been reached, and yet as you go up the chain, that we are finding that still the C-suite and the boardrooms are still remarkably imbalanced. So I'd love you to just describe for us what the glass ceiling in 2019 looks like.
So good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be here with Nancy, who I know shares my passion for gender equity in particular, but also diversity and inclusion. So obviously I don't have to tell you too much about the pyramid that Nancy is describing, in that we see more diversity at the entry level really everywhere, and then decreasing diversity at the top. Many reasons contribute to that. My own work has focused quite a bit on unconscious bias and the fact that our minds focus a lot on stereotypes and stereotypical thinking, in that we put people into categories, and if we don't associate a certain job or a certain function in a company, we don't naturally think of these kinds of people kind of being able to fulfill that role. And sadly, leadership in our minds still is associated with white men, therefore making it harder for women and other underrepresented groups to climb up the career ladder.
Do we, in looking for leaders, do you see a pattern of looking for the wrong qualities?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. The research on, for example, my particular expertise is obviously gender, so I'm going to focus heavily on gender. The research on gender differences in leadership, I think is not as strong as you might think. So the differences between male and female leaders are there, and I'll comment on them in just a moment, but these are really overlapping distributions. So don't think that male leaders are just very different from female leaders. Also, I should say, we don't have very many female leaders, so it's a really hard problem to study if you haven't had a female president in this country, for example. But yes, these are very tightly overlapping distributions. There's some evidence suggesting that women lead somewhat more collaboratively, more inclusively, more cooperatively than men, but I don't think we should be hung up by that.
So, as a starting point, how do we maybe overcome the most difficult bias of all, which is the belief that we're not biased?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first of all, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that we are all biased, and the good news is that we are all biased. So I'm going to explain what I mean with that. So it can also be somewhat liberating to acknowledge that this has something to do with how our minds work. This is not about pointing fingers at particular people. And another mistaken belief is that, for example, just because I'm a woman, I will be less biased against females in counter-stereotypical roles, so think engineers, for example. So my own gender doesn't protect me from these stereotypes. And I think that's a very important message. So this is not about pointing fingers. It's also not about women per se. This is about counter-stereotypical people. So think of male nurses or male kindergarten teachers. My own story that I tell in the book is that my husband and I had to drop off our son, it's now a long time ago, 18 years ago, when he was 4 months old, at a Harvard daycare center. and the first person we see and the person we actually had to hand the baby to was a man. And, you know, for some small moments, I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. It didn't take very long for me to overcome that, thankfully. But I'm telling you the story because my husband had the same reaction. So the fact that he was a man did not protect him from these stereotypes, right? So stereotypes or biases are very much shared. Seeing is believing. If we do not see male nurses or female venture capitalists, we don't associate those jobs with men and women. So I think it's starting to sink in for people that unconscious bias is just part of being human. But the good news is there's something we can do about it.
So why do so many efforts to address it at diversity training and unconscious bias training backfire?
So I would actually differentiate a little bit between diversity training and unconscious bias training only because I don't think we have enough evidence yet on unconscious bias training. But the first part of my book looks at the many things that we have been trying in the last 50 or 60 years, really since the civil rights movement. And diversity training, of course, is one of the big interventions that most companies, most organizations, not just private sector, but public sector academia have been using. And sadly, when I wrote the book, I didn't find one single study suggesting that diversity training works. And that's a really important message. And I'll give you a little bit of the psychology of why it is so hard to make it work. Now, diversity training might be able to raise some awareness, and I'll talk about backlash in just a moment. That's even worse. But it may be able to raise some awareness in the moment, right? It might open some doors, maybe some minds, some hearts. But it's really hard afterwards to live up to your virtuous intentions. Right? That is the crux of the problem. So think of living diversity, just for a moment, think of living diversity as you would be thinking about healthy eating. Right? Raising your awareness about healthy eating doesn't guarantee that you will not indulge in French fries and Swiss chocolate, which you should, Swiss, you know, or ice cream or something else tonight. It's just a little bit that same thing. It's this intention-action gap that good intentions don't always mean that we follow through with the right kinds of behaviors. So that's why diversity training, even very good diversity training, is actually hard to have an impact. Because tomorrow or in a week from now, you won't have your super ego sit on your shoulders. Now, Nancy asked me an even harder question in that, could it even backfire? And sadly, there is some evidence that it can backfire. It's called moral licensing. And what that means is that for some of us, having gone through diversity training feels like we've done the work. Now we can check the box, we're done with the topic, and to compensate for the pain that we've just gone through, we are engaging in more sexist and more racist behavior. And sadly, there is some evidence suggesting that that's happening. So yes, I'm a big fan, you can tell, of diversity training, because just the evidence, the data, tells me that that cannot be the answer.
So that's the bad news. The good news, which I just find also you use the word liberating. If it's liberating to recognize that we all have these biases and that in a way men and women about men and women. The good news is that there were very concrete interventions that the research also has shown work fantastically well. So can you tell us some? My favorite is the Boston Symphony, but pick your favorite.
Thank you. So my biggest message to you, I mean, even if you don't remember anything else we talk about, is don't try to de-bias mindsets. Try to de-bias systems. Right? Think about the bias that we have built into our human resource management, into our diversity practices, into our labor markets, into our organizations. That is my biggest message. And I'm going to start with the Symphony Orchestra, Nancy, because you've just mentioned it and because it's very close to home. As an example that I think is going to kind of highlight what that means, and then I'll give you another one as well. So many of you probably know that in the 70s, the Boston Symphony Orchestra started to have musicians audition behind a curtain. And it turns out that that has been studied intensely, and the curtain has helped increase the fraction of women in our major orchestras in this country from about 5% in the 70s to now 40%. And I think it's an important example because I don't think these orchestra directors or selection committees were out there to hurt women or were out there to discriminate against people of color. These were people, I think, who were trying to maximize the quality of the music. So they really were focused on performance, but they couldn't help paying attention to people's demographic characteristics, and that really got in the way of choosing the best quality musicians. So that's, I think, why it's an important example, because very often debiasing systems means doing the right thing, the morally right thing, in that meaning leveling the playing field for everyone, but also the economically smart thing that it allows us now to take advantage of 100% of the talent pool, when in fact before we couldn't quite listen to the music that an African American woman played, for example, the same way we could listening to music that a white man would be playing. So blind evaluations now are spreading, are increasingly adopted. I'm not saying it's the only design principle, so I want to be very clear. It's an example of a design principle that may or may not work for your organization, but for example, the UK government is the first big government which has introduced blind evaluations where they blind themselves to the names on people's CVs before they evaluate CVs for all the 450,000 employees. But let me give you, maybe if I may, one more example. A different one that's actually a new one that I don't talk about in the book because it's only about 1.5 years old now. So 1.5 years ago, I was in Stockholm, and I was invited by the Nobel Prize Foundation. And I was invited by them because they had realized that 97% of all Nobel Prizes had gone to men. So that's an uphill battle. But in any case, so they invited me because they wanted to learn about what they could be doing. And it was actually an interesting meeting because, of course, all of these procedures are super secretive. And so the first thing I had to tell them, well, I can't help you de-bias your selection procedures if you don't tell me anything about how you select Nobel Prize winners. But in any case, so some of this is still secret, some of this I can't share, but one thing I can share is an intervention that I suggested to them, not knowing much at all at the time. And I knew this because every year I get a form from the Nobel Foundation inviting me to make a nomination for somebody to get the prize in economics. I'm an economist by training. And so I knew exactly what that form looked like. And I'm telling you the story because sometimes behavioral design just means redesigning a form. Right? Sometimes it means introducing a curtain. But sometimes just means redesigning a form. So what we did was something very simple. I told them that diversity is much more likely to emerge if we make bundle choices. Here's what I mean with that. I'll give you a quick example. So an early study looked at snack choices, went into high school, asked half of the students to choose 30 snacks today for the next 30 days of the month. So all of you would now choose 30 snacks. You have endless choices available. All of you would be asked to choose a snack every morning of every day of the month. So you make a sequential choice, right? And I know many of you are in HR, so think a little bit about your own hiring and promotion procedures. Are these simultaneous choices where you kind of make a package decision, or are these sequential choices where Susie comes up now for promotion, but Henry comes up next week or next month? So in any case, what the researchers found was that this group here was much more likely to go for variety. Because if you choose 30 snacks now, even though you have a favorite snack, you cannot imagine that you would want to have the same thing 30 times in a row. Well, for you, it's much more likely that every morning you're like, apple chocolate bar, I'm gonna go for the chocolate bar today. So think of your favorite restaurant. You know, we all have been there. I always have the Caesar salad with crab meat at Legal Seafoods, and every time I'm like, can't do it again, but I'll do it again. Okay, so now back to the Nobel Prize. So I said, why don't you have nominators like myself make 3 recommendations? Because if you ask me to make one recommendation only, human minds will go back to their favorite snack. They'll go back to the typical kind of person, the person who conforms to our stereotypes. So think about how you make your people decisions in hiring and promotion. Is this more of a bundle approach, where you really have a portfolio and therefore think more about variety and diversity, or is this sequential, where you kind of are likely to go back to your favorite person?
Are there problems that blind evaluations don't solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So blind evaluations are particularly helpful if the diagnosis of the problem, by the way, Nancy, and I have to just spend a moment on this, when Siri Gilazzi, who's also sitting there in case you have any questions, from the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard, when she and I go and work with an organization, the first thing we do is a diagnostic. Right? We're not just saying do blind evaluations, do bundle hires, do this or that, but we are actually analyzing your data, trying to understand, what's broken. So we don't want to fix what's not broken. So the first thing has to be understanding, where are we losing women? Is it we don't hire them, we don't promote them, we look at performance appraisals, maybe some performance appraisals do not translate into goodies for everyone, maybe you get high ratings but then you're not promoted. That's one finding that we've just found with a company, a big gender gap in promotion ratings, even though they got high performance appraisals. So that's kind of what we do, and then we suggest an intervention. So that's why I wouldn't always suggest a blind evaluation procedure. Blind evaluation procedures work particularly well in situations where you feel that your problem really is unconscious bias, where you forego talent that you otherwise might be seeing, literally, might be hearing, might actually be open the doors to. And just to give you a concrete example, we worked with a tech company which used a software tool. It's called Applied, as in applied science, which blinds CVs. And what they learned was, previously, they thought they should only look at computer scientists and engineers. There's a tech company, a big tech company in Silicon Valley. And now with the blinding, where they didn't even look at CVs, but just did work sample tests, they all of a sudden found out that psychologists and neuroscientists did really well on those jobs, and they hired more psychologists and neuroscientists. So you can discover something if you free yourself, so to speak, from whatever the package is the person brings, whether that's kind of their background or their demographic characteristics. So it can work in that it diversifies kind of what you see. But, of course, if you are an organization which now values diversity already, and in fact thinks that you should be seeing who is applying to Harvard or to any other organization, because you think actually diversity advances the mission of your organization or of a university, then you don't want to do blind evaluations. So that's kind of the difference.
On the other hand, I'll warrant everyone in this room has been interviewed for a job, and most of you have interviewed people applying for jobs. You would get rid of unstructured interviews.
I would absolutely get rid of unstructured interviews. In fact, I would say the evidence says the unstructured interview is the worst tool to predict future performance in your organization, full stop.
So, and define what you mean by what happens in an unstructured interview that derails the process of finding the best people.
So, the problem with the unstructured interview is that you and I might then start talking about our favorite hobbies, our passions. We might find out that we have things in common that, in fact, have nothing to do with the job that I have to perform in this organization. And the problem is that our minds cannot filter out the noise from the useful information. Right? It's definitely useful information that Nancy will learn about me when she interviews me in an unstructured way, but there's also a lot of noise in that, we might start talking about Switzerland and hiking, but maybe we both love hiking, but hiking is likely not a good predictor to predict whether somebody is a successful professor at Harvard. So that's the problem with the unstructured interview. So what you can do is two things. Definitely move to structured interviews. That means you define the questions beforehand, and you ask everyone the same question, you rate the questions, and there's a whole protocol. There's a one-pager in my book which walks you through what the evidence says of what a predictive, evidence-based interview looks like. So if that interests you, please take a look at that page. But also, I want to put in a good word for work sample tests. Right? So if you hire somebody, think of the kinds of skills, the kinds of jobs, the kinds of tasks that the person will actually have to do, and design a test that then tests that kind of competence.
I will say I cannot recommend Iris's book highly enough to you, because it will actually give you really actionable tools. Whatever environment you're operating in, you will come away with insights that will help your success. And I say this as someone who typically does not read books written by economists and expect to have that be my reaction. So fear not. Like, I can vouch for the fact that it is a very readable but really useful book. So take Steve up on his offer, because it's a transformational set of insights, I think. Iris, thank you for sharing them, and thank all of you, and good luck with the rest of your conversations today.
Thanks very much.